the rivalry that changed Formula One. In the history of Formula One, there have been many great rivalries. Drivers fighting for championships, teams battling for supremacy, moments where talent, pride, and ambition collide at over 300 kilometers per hour. But very few rivalries have ever reached the intensity of the one between Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. Two extraordinary drivers, two completely different personalities, and two men who believed they were destined to be the best in the world. By the late 1980s, both drivers had already proven themselves as elite competitors in Formula One. They were fast, intelligent, and fearless when the championship was on the line. But when they became teammates at McLaren, something unexpected happened. Instead of creating harmony inside the most powerful team in the sport, their partnership ignited one of the most explosive rivalries in racing history. The team they drove for, McLaren, had built an incredibly dominant machine. With powerful Honda engines and brilliant engineering, the car was capable of beating nearly every competitor on the grid. For the team, having Senna and Prost together seemed like the perfect combination. One driver known for precision and strategy, the other known for raw speed and relentless determination. But Formula One has always had a dangerous rule when it comes to teammates. When two champions share the same garage, eventually only one of them can win. At first, the rivalry between Senna and Prost remained controlled. There was respect, professionalism, even moments of cooperation. But beneath the surface, tension was building. Both men wanted the same thing, the World Championship. And as the seasons progressed, their relationship slowly began to deteriorate. Every race became more intense. Every battle on track became more personal. And every small disagreement inside the team became harder to ignore. By 1989, the situation had reached a point where coexistence was no longer possible. The rivalry between Senna and Prost had grown too big, too emotional, too important. And the entire world of Formula One could feel that something dramatic was coming, something that would change the sport forever. The 1989 season begins. The 1989 Formula One season began with enormous expectations. McLaren was still the strongest team on the grid. Their car was fast, reliable, and perfectly engineered for championship battles. Naturally, the two drivers expected to dominate the season once again, but there was a difference now. The relationship between Senna and Prost had grown colder. Communication between them became minimal. Trust was disappearing. Each driver began to focus only on his own side of the garage. Each team of engineers worked harder to give their driver the advantage. And the competition between them became increasingly aggressive. Throughout the season, both drivers scored victories. Both drivers made mistakes. And both drivers pushed each other to the absolute limit. But as the championship progressed, the rivalry began to influence more than just racing results. Politics entered the picture. Alliances formed inside the paddock, and discussions about fairness, favoritism, and team orders began to dominate conversations behind closed doors. The atmosphere inside the McLaren garage was no longer comfortable. It was tense, unstable, explosive, and everyone in Formula One knew that eventually something would happen between these two drivers. Not if, but when. The road to Suzuka. As the season approached its final races, the championship standings told a very clear story. Alain Prost was leading, Ayrton Senna was chasing. The gap between them was not enormous, but it was significant enough to create a dangerous scenario for the Brazilian driver. Because if Prost finished ahead of Senna in the upcoming Japanese Grand Prix, the championship would be decided immediately. For Senna, the situation was brutally simple. He had to win. Anything less would put the title out of reach. That level of pressure changes everything in Formula One. It changes the way drivers approach overtakes, it changes the risks they are willing to take, and sometimes it pushes them into moments that become legendary. The next race would take place at Suzuka, a circuit already famous for deciding championships, a circuit that demanded absolute precision, and a circuit that would soon become the stage for one of the most controversial moments in the history of motorsport. Arrival in Suzuka. As the Formula One circus arrived in Japan for the penultimate round of the 1989 season, the atmosphere inside the paddock felt very different from a normal race weekend. There was tension everywhere. Journalists could sense it, engineers whispered about it, and the drivers themselves knew exactly what was at stake. The Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka had already developed a reputation as one of the most decisive races in the championship calendar. Over the years, several titles had been determined on this very track. But in 1989, the stakes were even higher. This was not simply a battle between two drivers from different teams. This was a civil war inside McLaren, and the two men at the center of that war were Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. By this point in the season, their rivalry had become impossible to hide. The respectful relationship that once existed between them had completely disappeared. They no longer spoke as teammates. They barely acknowledged each other in the garage. Each man operated inside his own circle of engineers and mechanics, almost as if they belonged to different teams. For McLaren, the situation was extremely delicate. On one hand, the team was dominating the championship. On the other hand, the internal conflict between their two drivers threatened to explode at any moment, and Suzuka would provide the perfect stage for that explosion. Why Suzuka matters. To understand why this race carried so much weight, it helps to understand the circuit itself. Suzuka is unlike almost any other track in Formula One. While many circuits are designed primarily for spectacle, Suzuka is designed for drivers. The layout is fast and flowing, filled with complex sequences of corners that require absolute precision. The famous S-curves demand perfect rhythm. The long spoon curve requires incredible balance and throttle control. And the final Casio triangle chicane forces drivers to brake from very high speeds into a tight technical corner. There is almost no room for error. Drivers often describe Suzuka as a circuit that reveals the true skill of a Formula One driver. And in 1989, two of the greatest drivers in the world would face that challenge under enormous pressure. For Ayrton Senna, Suzuka represented his last realistic opportunity to keep the championship alive. For Alain Prost, it represented the chance to secure the title once and for all. But beyond the mathematics of the championship, something deeper was happening. Both drivers wanted to prove something. Senna wanted to prove he was the fastest man in Formula One. Prost wanted to prove that intelligence and experience could defeat pure speed. The battle was no longer just about points. It had become personal. A paddock divided inside the McLaren garage, the situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The team management tried to maintain neutrality between the two drivers, but in reality, small divisions were forming. Certain engineers were closer to Senna. Others had worked with Prost for longer and trusted his feedback. Even mechanics began to feel the pressure of choosing sides. Every adjustment to the car was analyzed carefully. Every strategic decision was questioned, and every mistake carried enormous consequences. Ron Dennis, the team principal of McLaren, knew that the situation was dangerous. He wanted his team to win the championship. But he also knew that if the rivalry went too far, it could damage the entire organization. Still, controlling two fiercely competitive world-class drivers was never going to be easy. Both Senna and Prost were determined to win, and neither of them intended to back down. Practice sessions. When the cars finally took to the track for practice, the intensity of the championship battle immediately became visible. Both McLaren drivers pushed extremely hard, lap after lap. They fought for the fastest times. Their Honda-powered machines looked perfectly balanced around the Suzuka circuit. The engineers watched the data carefully. Senna appeared extremely comfortable with the car. His driving style matched the flowing rhythm of Suzuka perfectly. But Prost was also strong. His smooth, calculated approach allowed him to maintain consistent pace over long runs. As the practice sessions continued, it became clear that the race would once again be decided between the two McLaren drivers. The rest of the field simply did not have the performance to challenge them. This meant that the championship would likely be determined by a direct confrontation between Senna and Prost. And that possibility made everyone nervous, because if the two rivals met on track in a critical moment, no one could predict what might happen. The pressure before qualifying. By the time qualifying approached, the pressure had reached an almost unbearable level. Journalists filled the paddock with questions about the rivalry, fans speculated endlessly about the outcome of the race, and inside the McLaren garage, both drivers prepared for the most important sessions of the weekend. For Senna, qualifying had always been one of his greatest strengths. His ability to produce extraordinary speed over a single lap had already earned him numerous pole positions throughout his career. If he could start the race from the front, it would give him the best possible chance to control the race. For Prost, qualifying was important, but not everything. He knew that championships were often decided on Sunday, not Saturday. Still, starting close to Senna would be essential, because if the Brazilian escaped into the lead early in the race, catching him might become impossible. Everything now depended on what would happen during qualifying. And the stage was set for another incredible performance from one of Formula One's fastest drivers. The qualifying battle. By the time qualifying began at Suzuka, the tension inside the Formula One paddock had reached extraordinary levels. Everyone knew the championship was approaching a decisive moment. Journalists filled the pit lane, searching for signs of weakness or conflict between the two McLaren drivers. Fans packed the grandstands around the circuit, aware that they might witness one of the most important moments of the entire season. And inside the cockpit of his car, Ayrton Senna prepared for what he did best: qualifying. Throughout his career, Senna had built a reputation for producing astonishing performances over a single lap. When the pressure was highest, he often seemed capable of extracting speed from the car that others could not even imagine. At Suzuka, that ability would once again become critical, because starting from pole position could determine the entire race. If Senna started in front, he could control the pace. If Prost started ahead, the Brazilian would face an enormous challenge. Everything now depended on who would be faster on Saturday. Senna attacks the circuit. As the qualifying session began, the cars of McLaren immediately appeared at the top of the timing screens. The Honda engines roared through the fast curves of Suzuka. Both Senna and Prost pushed their machines to the absolute limit. But when Ayrton Senna began his fastest laps, something special happened. Through the famous S-curves, he carried incredible speed. The car flowed from corner to corner with almost impossible precision. Each steering input was perfectly balanced. Each acceleration was timed perfectly. Observers watching from the pit wall could see that Senna was driving on the edge of control, exactly where he was most dangerous. Sector by sector, the lap time improved. Through Degner Curve, the McLaren remained stable. Through Spoon Curve, Senna carried enormous speed onto the back straight, and when he crossed the finish line, the timing screens confirmed what many had expected. Ayrton Senna had taken pole position. Once again, he had produced a qualifying lap that no one else could match. Prost's response. Alain Prost was not easily intimidated. He had already won world championships. He had already faced some of the best drivers in Formula One history, but even he knew how dangerous Senna could be when starting from pole position. Prost continued pushing during the session, trying to close the gap. His lap times were strong, consistent, precise. But they were not quite enough. When the qualifying session ended, the starting grid told a very clear story. Ayrton Senna would start first. Alain Prost would start second. Once again, the two McLaren drivers would begin the race side by side. For the spectators, it was the perfect scenario. For the team, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. Because if the two rivals reached the first corner together, anything could happen. A silent garage. After qualifying, the atmosphere inside the McLaren garage became strangely quiet. Normally, a pole position would be a moment of celebration, but this time nobody felt comfortable celebrating. The team understood the situation too well. Starting first and second meant the race would almost certainly become a direct fight between Senna and Prost. And given the tension between them, that fight could easily become dangerous. Ron Dennis and the McLaren engineers discussed strategy carefully. They hoped that both drivers would race professionally. They hoped that the championship could be decided cleanly on track. But deep down, many people inside the team feared something else. Because the rivalry between Senna and Prost had already crossed the line between competition and conflict. And when emotions become stronger than strategy in Formula One, the results can be explosive. The night before the race. As night fell over Suzuka, the drivers prepared for the most important race of the season. In his hotel room, Ayrton Senna focused intensely on the challenge ahead. He knew the situation perfectly. If he won the race, the championship fight would continue. If he lost to Prost, the title would be gone. For Senna, that meant only one possible approach: attack. He would push as hard as necessary to win. Across the circuit, Alain Prost prepared in his own way. The French driver understood the mathematics of the championship. He did not necessarily need to win the race. All he needed was to finish ahead of Senna. That difference in strategy would prove extremely important. Because when the lights went out the next day, both drivers would approach the race with completely different mindsets. One driver fighting for survival in the championship, the other defending his position. And those two approaches would collide in one of the most controversial moments in Formula One history. The race begins race day at Suzuka, arrived with an atmosphere unlike any other. The grandstands were packed with fans who had traveled from all over Japan to witness the championship battle. The sound of engines echoed through the circuit as mechanics made their final adjustments, and engineers checked the last details on the cars. But behind all the excitement, there was a deep sense of tension. Everyone knew what could happen. Two teammates, two fierce rivals, starting from the front row, and the championship hanging in the balance. As the cars lined up on the starting grid, Ayrton Senna sat in a pole position. Directly behind him was Alain Prost. The two McLaren cars, painted in their famous red and white colors, looked almost identical, But inside the cockpits, the mindset of the drivers could not have been more different. Senna knew he needed victory. Prost knew he only needed to stay ahead. And that difference would shape the entire race. The start. When the lights went out, the crowd erupted. Senna launched from the grid with an aggressive start, trying to defend his position into the first corner. Prost reacted immediately. The two McLarens charged toward turn one side by side, neither driver willing to give an inch. But Senna managed to hold the inside line and kept the lead. Behind them, the rest of the field struggled to keep up as the two rivals began pulling away from the pack. Within only a few laps, the race had already turned into a private duel between the McLaren teammates. Their cars were clearly faster than the rest of the grid, and as the laps passed, the gap behind them grew larger. But while the gap to the other drivers increased, the tension between Senna and Prost continued to build. Because Prost was not letting Senna escape. He stayed close. Very close. The chase lap after lap, Prost followed Senna through the twisting layout of Suzuka. The two cars danced through the S-curves at incredible speed. Their engines screamed down the back straight. And every braking zone became a moment of potential danger. Senna tried to increase the pace. He pushed harder through the corners, attempting to create a gap. But Prost remained calm. The French driver understood the situation perfectly. He did not need to take unnecessary risks. All he needed was to stay close enough to respond when the opportunity appeared. Meanwhile, Senna knew that simply leading the race might not be enough. He needed to secure victory, and that meant he would have to defend every corner. The pressure on both drivers grew with every lap. Inside their cockpits, the focus was absolute, at speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Even the smallest mistake could end the race instantly. But neither driver made mistakes. They continued pushing harder, faster, closer. A battle within the same team. Inside the McLaren pit wall, engineers watched the timing screens with growing concern. Normally, seeing two of their cars leading the race would be a perfect scenario, but this situation felt dangerous. The rivalry between Senna and Prost had become too intense, too personal. Every lap increased the chances of something going wrong. Team radio communication remained minimal. Both drivers preferred to concentrate entirely on the race. But the engineers could see something worrying. The gap between the two McLarens was shrinking. Prost was getting closer. Each lap, the French driver moved a little nearer to Senna's rear wing. And eventually, the distance between them became small enough to attempt an overtake. The moment everyone feared was approaching. The decisive lap. As the race entered its final stages, the pressure reached its peak. Prost was now directly behind Senna, close enough to challenge, close enough to attack. The two McLarens approached one of the most critical sections of the circuit, the final chicane before the start-finish straight, known as the Casio Triangle. It was one of the few places on the track where overtaking was possible. Senna defended his position carefully, but Prost was determined. As they approached the braking zone, both drivers committed completely. Neither of them wanted to give up the championship, and neither of them intended to back down. In the next few seconds, the rivalry between Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost would reach its most explosive moment. The crash that shocked Formula One. As the race approached its final laps, the tension between Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost reached an almost unbearable level. For nearly the entire race, the two McLaren drivers had been locked in a relentless battle. Senna led. Prost chased. Lap after lap, the gap between them remained small enough to keep the pressure constant. Inside the cockpit of his car, Senna understood the situation perfectly. If he won the race, the championship fight would remain alive. If Prost finished ahead of him, The title would be over. There was no room for hesitation. Meanwhile, Prost approached the race with a very different mindset. The French driver did not necessarily need victory. All he needed was to finish ahead of Senna. That difference in strategy created a dangerous situation. One driver needed to attack. The other only needed to defend. And in Formula One, when those two motivations collide, the result can be explosive. The approach to the chicane. As the cars raced through the final sector of Suzuka, Prost remained directly behind Senna, close enough to see every movement of the Brazilian's car, close enough to attempt an overtake. The track narrowed as they approached the final section of the circuit. Ahead of them was the Casio Triangle Chicane, one of the most technical braking zones on the track. Drivers approached this corner at very high speed before slowing dramatically to navigate the tight turns. It was also one of the few realistic overtaking opportunities at Suzuka. Senna knew Prost might try something. So he defended the racing line carefully, but Prost was preparing for his own move. As they accelerated toward the braking zone, both drivers understood that the next few seconds could decide the championship. Neither of them intended to surrender. The collision. As they reached the braking zone for the chicane, Senna made his move. He positioned his car on the inside line, attempting to overtake Prost before the corner. It was a bold and aggressive maneuver. But Prost reacted immediately. Instead of leaving space for the Brazilian, he turned toward the corner as if Senna were not there. The two McLaren cars made contact at high speed. The impact pushed both machines off the racing line. Their wheels tangled. The cars slid straight into the escape road. Suddenly, both championship contenders were stopped in the runoff area of the chicane. For a moment, the entire race seemed frozen. The crowd gasped. Engineers inside the McLaren garage stared at their monitors in disbelief. The championship battle had just exploded in front of the entire world. Prost walks away. After the collision, Alain Prost climbed out of his car. From his perspective, the race was finished. His engine had stalled, and the car was positioned awkwardly in the escape area. But Prost also understood the championship mathematics. If Senna could not continue the race either, the result would secure the championship for him. So the French driver calmly walked away from the scene. Inside the cockpit of the other McLaren, however, Senna was not ready to give up. His car was damaged, but it was still running. And Senna was determined to continue the race if there was even the smallest chance of doing so. Senna refuses to quit track marshals, rushed towards Senna's car. The Brazilian signaled for help. He wanted the car pushed. After several moments, the marshals managed to push the McLaren forward. The engine roared back to life. Senna accelerated out of the escape road and returned to the circuit. The crowd erupted with excitement. Despite the crash, the Brazilian was still in the race. But the drama was far from over. Because what happened next would create one of the most controversial decisions in the history of Formula One. The most controversial decision in Formula One history. After the collision at the chicane, the championship battle seemed over. Alain Prost had already walked away from his car. From the outside, it looked like both McLaren drivers were finished. But Ayrton Senna had other plans. His car was damaged. His front wing had been bent during the collision. But the engine was still running, and Senna refused to abandon the race. With the help of the track marshals, his car was pushed forward and the engine restarted. The Brazilian accelerated back onto the track, determined to continue. The crowd watching at Suzuka could hardly believe what they were seeing. Against all expectations, Senna was still fighting. The impossible comeback. Once back on track, Senna drove with extraordinary determination. His car was not perfect anymore, The damage from the collision affected the balance of the car. But Senna pushed as if the championship depended on every single corner. Because it did. He began chasing the cars ahead of him. One by one, he regained positions. The pace was astonishing. Despite the earlier incident, Senna was now one of the fastest drivers on the circuit. Eventually, he reached the leading group. And after a decisive overtaking maneuver, Senna moved into first place. Against all odds, the Brazilian had taken the lead of the race. For a brief moment, it looked like one of the greatest recoveries in Formula One history. But the story was not finished yet. Because behind the scenes, race officials were reviewing what had happened at the chicane. The investigation inside race control, the stewards began analyzing the collision between Senna and Prost. They studied the footage. They examined the circumstances of the incident. And they also considered something else. After the crash, Senna had returned to the track by using the escape road. According to the regulations, drivers were expected to rejoin the track safely and without gaining an advantage. Some officials believed that Senna had violated this rule. Others argued that he had simply continued the race after being forced off the track by the collision. But the final decision would soon be announced, and it would shock the entire world of motorsport. The disqualification. Even though Senna crossed the finish line in first place, the celebration did not last long. Race officials announced that Ayrton Senna had been disqualified. The official reason given was that he had rejoined the track incorrectly after the collision. As a result, his victory was removed from the final classification. Alain Prost, who had already retired from the race, was declared the winner of the championship battle. With that decision, Prost secured the 1989 Formula One World Championship. But the controversy exploded immediately. Fans, journalists, and drivers all began debating the decision. Many believed that the punishment was unfair. Some even suggested that politics had played a role. At the center of that controversy was the president of the FIA at the time, Jean-Marie Balestre. Balestre was French, just like Alain Prost. And that coincidence fueled accusations that the decision had been influenced by national bias. Whether those accusations were true or not, the damage was already done. The rivalry between Senna and Prost had reached a new level of hostility. Senna's reaction. Ayrton Senna was furious. In interviews after the race, he openly criticized the decision. He believed that the crash had been a racing incident, and he strongly rejected the idea that he had done anything wrong by continuing the race. To Senna, the disqualification felt like an injustice. But it also strengthened his determination. He promised that the story between him and Prost was not finished, and he would get another chance. 1 year later, at the same circuit, at Suzuka. The rivalry that defined an era. The events of the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix became one of the most controversial moments in Formula One history. It transformed the rivalry between Senna and Prost into something legendary. Two extraordinary drivers, two completely different personalities, one driven by emotion and instinct, the other guided by calculation and strategy. Their rivalry would shape the entire era of Formula One during the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the story would continue. Because when the championship returned to Suzuka in 1990, Senna and Prost would meet again. But this time, the outcome would be even more explosive. The legacy of Suzuka 1989 today, decades later, the crash at Suzuka in 1989 is still discussed by Formula One fans around the world. Some believe Senna was right. Others believe Prost made the correct defensive move. But everyone agrees on one thing. That moment changed the history of the sport. It was more than just a racing incident. It was the climax of one of the greatest rivalries ever seen in motorsport. And it set the stage for an even more dramatic chapter the following year. Because in 1990, Ayrton Senna would return to Suzuka with only one objective: revenge.